being white has been far easier than not being white.
Oh, God, I love being white. I really do.
I'm speaking as a black man from America, which is a racist society. No matter how much you hear it talk about democracy, it's as racist as South Africa, or as racist as Portugal, or as racist as any other racialist society on this earth. The only difference between it and South Africa preaches separation and practices separation. America preaches integration and practices segregation. This is the only difference. They don't practice what they preach. Whereas South Africa preaches and practices the same thing. I have more respect for a man who lets me know where he stands, even if he's wrong, than the one who comes up like an angel and is nothing but a devil.
Basically, our very first law as a constitutional republic gave white immigrants privileges that black people and immigrants of color and indigenous native North Americans weren't given, all of it based purely on skin color. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, this kind of systematic white privilege and race-based favoritism is built into the very foundations of the country.
In 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt put his signature on the Social Security Act.
Look at all the social programs that pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression and helped create the middle class in this country. Programs like job insurance, which provided cash to people to give them a leg up as they looked for work.
To show how job insurance works, let's introduce Steve, a Louisiana worker who has just lost his job. He goes first to the nearest state employment office to register for a new job. Steve needn't hesitate about going in, because this office was set up just to help people like him.
But while Steve in Louisiana could apply for job insurance, not everyone else could.
Of course, he cannot collect if he belongs to any of the groups of workers that the law does not insure. These are agricultural workers, domestic service in private homes.
Agricultural workers and domestic service workers didn't qualify for assistance, and it turns out this had everything to do with race. These two jobs were overwhelmingly held by black people, and over 80% of all blacks worked in those professions. So the only way FDR could get Southern Democrats to support the Social Security Act was if he agreed to exclude those workers from benefits. This was a conscious attempt by some in Congress to exclude as many blacks as possible, and the net effect of it was to give preferential treatment to whites.
Thousands of people get a big thrill out of looking at model houses, and a much bigger thrill when they buy one.
It was the same story with crucial housing assistance for the American middle class. Loans provided by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, allowed working-class families for really the first time in American history to own their own homes.
Home ownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens.
But the way the bill was written, the American dream of home ownership wasn't within the reach of everyone. For the first 30 years of the program, about 98% of the recipients were white. People of color were almost completely barred. Then there was the GI Bill, which provided immense benefits to returning veterans, including low-cost mortgages, loans to start a business, cash payments for tuition, and living expenses. What the GI Bill didn't do is protect black veterans, who qualified for that assistance also, from the kinds of legal discrimination rampant in pre-civil rights America. The result was that the vast majority of those who benefited from the GI Bill were white veterans. If a program like the GI Bill ended up disproportionately benefiting people of color, you know what we'd call that? We'd call it welfare. We'd call it a reward, a handout, a gravy train.
The GI Bill of Rights is not a reward, or a handout, or a gravy train.
But that's not the way it was described.
But rather an American way to make it easier for each man to take his place once again in the community and get some of those things for which he went to war.
And I'm not trying to say programs like these are bad. There's no question. They've been instrumental in creating and expanding opportunities for millions of people. The point is that we're being dishonest if we fail to explicitly acknowledge how they almost exclusively benefited white people.
Who is covered by the Social Security Act? People like these.
It needs to be understood that for hundreds of years, government assistance programs pumped literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of wealth into the hands of white families before people of color even got to the starting gate. This is what we're talking about when we talk about white privilege, the structural advantages built into our very system that have helped white people, often without us knowing it, while making things more difficult for people of color.
For me, being white means that I'm treated as the default in a lot of cases.
Some of those privileges would be material, better job opportunities, better housing access, better educational opportunities, but some of them are psychological. Just the realization that I'm not going to be racially profiled when I'm driving around town or when I'm shopping in the mall, that I'm not going to be followed by store security because they think I might shoplift.
Before I got to college and stuff, I don't know, I was more of like a punk and what have you, so there were times where I would be like shoplifting, and my race occurred to me then because I was like, man, I feel like if I was any other race or ethnicity, I would be being watched by like security. So I felt very, you know, like nothing would happen, so I didn't really mind doing it because I didn't get caught ever.
I read a paper where somebody was listing an experience where it was a group of females talking about, you know, what it's like to be a woman, and there was a white woman talking to a black woman saying, you know, well, we have similar experiences because we're both women, and the black woman looks at her and says, no, we don't, and she goes, well, yeah, but we're both women, and the black woman says, no, because when you look in the mirror, you're a woman. When I look in the mirror, I'm a black woman. So it's that thing that you have to, it's that thing that you don't notice.
For myself, from the very beginning, I was seen as a bright and capable child, and I was tracked into the higher level classes. If I didn't do well, I never had to worry that it would be ascribed to my race, that someone might say, well, of course he didn't do really very well in the SAT because, you know, he is white. And this isn't just an anecdotal one-off story. The fact is there are 20 to 25 years of research, studies which have found that students of color all around the country are worried about confirming negative stereotypes in the classroom. Any fear that somehow they might live down to a negative group stigma directly affects their performance on tests. That's something that I, as a white student, didn't have to worry about. And so we live with the legacy of inequality that began so long ago, but also the legacy of obliviousness that allows those of us in the dominant group to rarely even think about these matters. And even with all the changes and the progress we have seen, that is something that hasn't changed.
Well, just as in World War II, this country could use its news media to propagandize and make the whole American public love the Germans and the Japanese, rather love the Russians and the Chinese and hate the Germans and the Japanese. And then after the war, they changed it and made the American public love the Germans and love the Japanese, hate the Russians and hate the Chinese, which shows that they can make the American public love whom they will and hate whom they will. And that same process can be used to re-educate the American public and show white people how to love black people and show black people how to do something to stand on our own feet and solve our own problems. The black man doesn't have to be taught to love the white man. The white man has to be taught to love the black man.
I'm white. I know. Congrats, Lacey, you've figured out your race. But this is actually pretty significant. For most of my life, I was blissfully unaware of the fact that I'm white. My race never affected me, a huge benefit I didn't even know that I had. Growing up, I knew racism is bad, but I didn't really understand what racism is. I thought racism was slurs, discrimination, hating someone based on their skin color. About 50 years ago, direct, in-your-face, this overt racism became illegal and less socially acceptable, which had two side effects on white America. First, it allowed us to believe that racism is over. Yeah, I'm okay, I love that guy. Secondly, it enabled white folks to frame the ongoing struggles of the black community as a character flaw. So after Ferguson, a family member said to me, "Look, Lacey, black people have a lot of problems because they have a bad culture, bad values. They're violent, they're lazy, broken families. Look at them out there riding like animals. That's not racism, that's just the facts." Whoa there, tell me how you really feel. Now, people usually aren't so blunt about it, but if you look closely, you're going to see these sentiments about black America echoed everywhere.
So I taught school for 20 years. A lot of people of color who didn't want to work as hard, they wanted it given to them.
They don't make a living for themselves. They just drop out of high school. I'm gonna have kids. I'm gonna get a welfare check.
I'm gonna get my GED.
I'll get my GED. I'm gonna go work at McDonald's.
Young black men often reject education
and gravitate towards the street culture, drugs, hustling, gangs. Nobody forces them to do that. Again, it is a personal decision.
The message, to be black is to be inferior. But that's not the facts, that's just racism. Racism isn't just burning crosses and white hoods. Racism is a seeping system of forces that effectively keep people of color in a permanent second-class status. It's the foundational fabric of our society, woven with values and attitudes, stereotypes, policies, economics, laws. Jim Crow was replaced with a host of shiny new laws that were just as racist, but looked better on the surface. This has made it harder than ever for white America to see the truth. The odds are ever in our favor, and they always have been. Let's take a stroll down memory lane. Stop 1. Wealth. Between 1934 and 1962, the government backed $120 billion of home loans. But they refused to give out home loans to black folks, or even if black folks lived nearby. This went on for decades. This practice, called redlining, essentially 1. Forced black Americans into poor urban centers, the beginnings of the ghetto. 2. Segregated America to this day. 3. Made it impossible to invest in the future of black neighborhoods. And 4. Made it impossible for black Americans to start inheriting property and wealth the same way that white Americans were. Stop 2. Education. Property taxes fund schools, which means that families that live in nice houses, maybe ones they got with the help of the government, get a better education. Better education means more opportunities, more resources, more connections, more jobs, more money, money, money. Stop 3. Jobs. The lack of educational opportunities meant that many black folks were relegated to low-wage manual labor. Today, when looking at the same exact resume, employers are 50% more likely to call back a resume labeled with a white-sounding name. Stop 4. Mass incarceration. Shortly after the Civil Rights Movement, prisons became privatized for-profit businesses. Fill those cells, make those dollars, and they did. The prison population shot up from 200,000 to 2.4 million. More than any country in the world. And who filled those cells? People of color.
More African American adults are under correctional control today than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began.
Black men are now imprisoned at 6 times the rate of white men. So did black men just become 6 times more dangerous? Or of course not. What changed was the laws and sentencing. Sweeping laws were written that specifically targeted black communities. For instance, the sentence for possession of crack was 100 times harsher than the sentence for cocaine. Stop 5. Racial profiling. It wasn't just harsher sentencing. Communities of color are also policed more harshly.
One of the few memories I have of my dad as a kid is seeing him yelled at and questioned by police on the street. And when they didn't like the answers he was giving them to their questions, they proceeded to aggressively question me. And I was just 8 years old.
Policies like Show Me Your Papers and Stop and Frisk target people of color under the law. Totally legal. So shocker, they're much more likely to get arrested for doing the same things that white people do, but twice as likely to get pulled over. Take the late Walter Scott, who was pulled over for having a broken taillight, only to be shot 5 times in the back by a cop. Stop 6. Police brutality. Police brutality is front and center of the race conversation right now. Twice a week in the U.S., white officers kill black suspects, most of whom are unarmed. And the consequences are minimal, if any. Might even get paid a bunch of money for it. The police themselves admit to widespread usage of excessive force and racial bias. So what does America do? Oh, just give them military supplies, of course. Tanks, protective gear, firepower used in war, all the while wagging a finger at protesters that dare to be outraged by it. Sadly, this is all just the tip of the racism iceberg. We really need to ask ourselves, what's really causing the problems that we're observing in America? What advantages has white America been given, often without even realizing it? The first step in combating racism, and often the hardest step, is acknowledging it. Acknowledging that the system is unfair. Racism is a powerful institution built by 400 years of slavery, 100 years of outright discrimination, 50 plus more years of covert discrimination. A legacy that long in the making doesn't just disappear overnight. America got a lot of work to do.